This is NICU Babies Parent Support with Catherine Whitaker, a podcast from Hand to Hold, a national nonprofit that provides free personalized support, resources, and community before, during, and after a NICU stay. My conversations here will focus on education and personal stories with medical and hospital professionals, counselors, therapists, and NICU moms and dads from across the country. Whether you're preparing for a NICU stay, you're currently there, or you're months and years past your stay, you belong here. The NICU is hard. We're here to help. I'm your host, Catherine Whitaker, the mom of 6 children, including my very own NICU baby, and I'm so honored you're here. Hey y'all, welcome back to the podcast. Haven't you loved the series on pre-eclampsia? I know that I have really enjoyed being the one to bring these stories and this information to you. We started off 3 weeks ago with Dr. Barry as a maternal fetal medicine doctor. He really laid the groundwork well of clinically speaking, what is preeclampsia? What do you need to know? What does it look like? And all the things that you should be asking your doctor. And then lived experience. And I was so grateful that both the Gervis family and the Adams family were so transparent and so candid and honest about what it was like when they received the diagnosis, for the Gervis family when they lost their baby, and for the Adams family when they left, but they also left with some complications. I was really thankful that that lived experience was what you were able to hear, because it's one thing to get the basis of what is preeclampsia down, but I think it's a whole other thing to hear what does it really look like in a real family. And I was so deeply grateful for the two of them. We're kind of coming full circle today. My guest today, Parijat, is an exceptional human being. She has not only lived experience, but she also has practical experience when it comes to serving her clients and helping them navigate through trauma. And I felt like she was the perfect guest to sort of help us wrap up this series and sort of give us a more full picture of what it may look like to carry a high-risk pregnancy. What do you do when you get that information? And then how do you navigate through that? And what does it look like on the other side? I didn't want to leave you hanging. I wanted y'all to get a really complete picture of preeclampsia as we really dive in deep during this awareness month. And what does it really look like? So today's guest is Parijat Deshpande. She is an author, a speaker, and the CEO of a global boutique company dedicated to reducing pregnancy complications and ending preterm birth. She has served hundreds of women through her programs and one-on-one work, helping them manage pregnancy complications and reclaim a safety and a trust in their bodies that they thought was eroded forever. After her own experience with a high-risk pregnancy, Parijat went from patient to practitioner to help other women beat the statistics. It's a journey that she has chronicled in her best-selling book, Pregnancy Brain, a mind-body approach to stress management during a high-risk pregnancy. And with that, let's chat. So Parijat, I'm so excited to have you here. We have been doing this beautiful series of giving people a deeper dive into what it really looks like to have a preeclampsia diagnosis, and then what it looks like whenever you leave the hospital and you still have to deal with that preeclampsia diagnosis. And that is why you were here, because we've heard some beautiful stories from 2 different families, but we've also talked to a maternal fetal medicine doctor. But I think it's often been said that every NICU stay is accompanied by grief, because we all lose something in the NICU. So I know in your experience and what you do with moms and families is that you help them work through that trauma. But I think that this term somatic trauma professional may be something that people have never heard of before, or maybe they don't know much about. So maybe walk us through what is that and why were you led to pursue that career?
Absolutely. So broadly speaking, somatic trauma professional is basically anybody who has studied and understands trauma physiology, stress physiology, meaning what happens in the body when that stress response kicks off. And the way that we guide people through the healing process, and in my case, also then supporting them to have healthy pregnancies next time, is body-based. So unlike modalities like CBT or journaling or meditation, which are all thought-based, kind of cognitive up here modalities, we focus entirely on the body and how the body needs to kind of recover from what we just went through. I was completely led here by my personal experience. I would not have known to be doing this work had I not gone through infertility and losses and a very high risk pregnancy and an extremely preterm delivery and many months in the NICU with my son. That genuinely, truly is what brought me here, because I recognized the limitations of my training in clinical psychology, which was all thought-based, that when I became the patient, I went, I think there's something missing here that I need. And okay, we got to go figure out what that is. Um, and so, truthfully, it was that combination of already having that professional expertise, then having this entirely different lived experience, and then coming out on the other side and saying, I need to change my career. Everything needs to be swapped out because I want to help people like me in a way that I know can be even more effective than what I was already aware of. And so that led to a whole new world of training that kind of brought me to where we are today.
Well, sometimes life gives you an opportunity to say, okay, I've been given this experience, and do I hold on to it or do I help other people navigate through it? So this seems to be a recurring theme. And many of the guests that I've had is that it was a life change that sort of redirected and they said yes. And now they're doing things like you're doing. So you wrote this book, Pregnancy Brain,
Mhm.
which really, I think, empowers parents. But I'd love to hear from your perspective, what kind of a resource is that for parents and how can that help them sort of navigate through high risk or a difficult pregnancy?
Yeah, I wrote the book I wished I'd had, to be quite honest. When I was on bed rest and modified activity restrictions is the official word for it, for many, many weeks during my pregnancy, I was just sitting there and a lot of friends were dropping off pregnancy books, and I'm going, I'm not thinking about the nursery. I'm not thinking about car seats. I just want to know why I'm bleeding at 10 weeks into my pregnancy and it's not stopping, that kind of a thing. So I genuinely wrote that, the resource where you're on a complicated journey. It's not simple. It's not easy. You can't see yourself in other pregnancy books. I wanted people to see themselves in this book. And so what I'm hearing is it's resonating with the loss community, the infertility community, people who've experienced high risk pregnancies before and really want to understand what just happened and what else can I do to prevent these complications from happening next time. And that's really where Pregnancy Brain fits in.
I wish that your book had been around whenever I had my preemie 13 years ago, but you're right. The books address normal, for the most part, normal progressing pregnancies. And then when your category of pregnancy doesn't fall into any of those, you kind of feel unseen and you feel lost. So it's a really great resource. I know people can find it, I'm assuming on Amazon, but also on your website. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Awesome.
Pregnancybrainbook.com is the best way to go. Lots of different places to get it from.
Awesome. Um, so I want to dive into the trauma part of what a difficult pregnancy can do for you. I mean, I think that if there's a woman who finds herself and she's in a difficult pregnancy or her OBGYN has designated her as high risk, what are some things that she can do to sort of minimize the trauma that either is currently happening or may happen as she finds herself either in a NICU situation or in a difficult medical situation with her baby?
Yeah. I mean, that's essentially the whole premise of my program Path to Baby is how do we prevent the experience of trauma when you're on a complicated journey? And I think to be able to answer that, we've got to start with what is trauma. And I really want to highlight for people that it is not a mental health issue. It is a whole body issue. It's not even
Amen.
an issue.
Say
It's a
that a
whole
little louder
body.
for the people in the back.
It's a whole body response to a threat. When we talk about traumatic stress, what we are talking about is a stress response that kicks off, which is another way is called a threat response, where something is challenging your sense of safety. It could be the diagnosis of being called high risk. It could be the actual pregnancy complication. It could be something else entirely. And that threat kicks off an entire full body response that puts us in this threat state. When we cannot come out of that threat state for any number of reasons, that's what we call trauma. That's what that is. And so, generally speaking, the way to prevent a traumatic experience, or how, as I say to my clients, for any experience to be encoded physiologically as trauma, what we have to do is make sure that we can complete that stress cycle. That's what we have to focus on. And I find that when we talk about it this way, suddenly it feels a lot more doable because now I'm not trying to control my thoughts and my feelings, which seems impossible to do.
Right.
But what we're actually focusing on is very actionable strategies to go, okay, my body needs to complete this cycle. How do I do that given who I am and my history and what's going on in my health right now? It just gives us a lot more opportunity to protect ourselves from what could be coming up.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to some of the traumatic things that happened. I think every NICU parent that's listening to this can pinpoint a specific thing. We all have our triggers of things that sort of, and even years later, those triggers show up. But I think that recognizing that trauma happens and then how do we either mitigate it or how do we work our way through it? Before we dive a little bit deeper into that, I read this on your website and I was really glad that you shared it because about 3 weeks ago, I interviewed a beautiful mom of quads, a mom of color, and we were talking about Black maternal health awareness. And I know that serving people in the BIPOC community, so that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color, is a real emphasis of yours. Can you explain to people why that's so important to you?
Absolutely. To begin, I am part of that community. Being of South Asian origin, I recognize how different my experience is inside the medical community, inside the society in general, than it is for a white woman who's maybe exactly my age, exactly similar history. We have additional challenges. And then you add on the specific communities of the Indigenous population, of the Black community, and they have even more challenges. We have a medical system that does not know how to center women, especially women of color, especially Black and Indigenous women. And that is contributing to so many of our adverse outcomes here because there is that implicit and inherent racism, the biases inside of even the training systems that our providers are going through. It is there. It is in the society. It is in the way that we experience the world day to day, even outside of the medical appointments, outside of the pregnancies that are affecting all those experiences are affecting the health of a pregnancy. You know, pregnancy doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's the culmination
Right.
of everything that's happened before that. And we have to take that context into consideration, especially for marginalized communities who we know are experiencing negative uh, relationships and conversations and are in this place of already bracing themselves for not being heard or seen or believed. And when we talk about how to mitigate trauma, I mean, we have to consider all of that. If
Right.
somebody is walking into that system already with the experience of I'm not believed, I'm not taken seriously, or nobody knows how to help somebody like me, or nobody's going to believe somebody like me, we're already 4 steps ahead. You know, I mean, I'm making up the number 4, but we are already at a disadvantage. And so I think we cannot overemphasize the amount of specific and tailored support that people of the BIPOC community deserve and need, especially when they're on a complicated family building journey.
You segued beautifully into my next question, and I don't think you even meant to do it, but you often say, and you state this on your website, that women are not at the mercy of statistics. So we know that the statistics exist, we know that the bias exists, um, but I think sometimes those statistics can feel very overwhelming, very limiting to some people, and as I'm thinking of all the things that you have to work through as a NICU mom or as a preterm mom, and wondering like how's this all going to play out? How does a woman, particularly one who's in a high risk pregnancy, how does she sort of, one, identify what those challenges are, what those statistics are? How does she address those? And then how does she move forward? Because I
Yeah.
think sometimes we can let those statistics, those things limit us, and then we feel like we're on a train wreck to nowhere. And so how do you move through all that?
Absolutely. I mean, just even hearing that question, I'm instantly brought back to when I was in the hospital, 22 weeks and 5 days. It was after I was admitted. And my team came in and they're just telling me all these statistics of the
Hmm.
likelihood of survival and long-term issues for my son and all of these things. And I shared this, I think, in Pregnancy Brain, that the only thought I had at that point was they're not saying 100% or they're not
Hmm.
saying 0%. And that can sound a little Pollyanna, and I understand that. But if you could just hear me out for just a moment, that was enough. That was enough to say, even if you're telling me there's a 2% chance of survival, what is in that 2% that I can control? And that became my focus.
Good.
That became where I spent my energy, because there's plenty of things that I can't control, as we had experienced up until that point in the pregnancy and continue to experience it. But in that 2%, right, what is that ability where I can come in and influence even a tiny bit? Because at the end of the day, we all know when we've been on this journey that we can do everything, quote unquote, perfectly by the book, and still things can go wrong. We understand that. I think this community is so aware of the realities, really aware of the realities. And so what we want to do is kind of go, where can I have a place to just maybe shift the direction a little bit, just a tiny bit, because that sense of agency, that level of control or power, whatever you want to call it, is a mitigating factor for experiencing traumatic stress and encoding that experience as traumatic. A lot of people have a hard time really hearing this or believing this, but I've worked with a lot of clients where after we have gone through some of this work, if they do deliver preterm, for example, that the experience is not encoded as traumatic because we know how to complete that stress cycle. We know how to give ourselves the ability to be in that driver's seat, even if it's for a little while, in a tiny little way. And so in that 2%, for example, then what I typically do with my clients is we go, all right, there are 3 ways that you can essentially affect your outcome. One is your somatic health, one is your overall health, and one is your health care, which is the absolute easiest that you can access right now. And usually by this point, we've been working together long enough that we both can kind of go, oh, it's definitely this one. And then you go full in. And you fully throw yourself in there and you go, how can I influence this? What questions should I be asking? Who should I be having on my team? Is this an opportunity to replace somebody on my team? If it's the healthcare piece, if it's the somatic piece, and we really dive deep into what is your body showing us that's coming up for you physiologically that we can do. If it's your overall health and we're looking at lifestyle changes, is there anything that we can tweak right now that's going to make a difference? We're not looking for magic cures. We all know that doesn't exist. But there are so many ways that these tiny little blocks that we put together can make a really big difference on the other side.
Well, which correlates beautifully to, preemies who we measure their progress in teeny tiny little steps, but yet we expect great big strides in ourselves. And I think our preemies teach us that, remember mom, remember dad, remember all the people who love me, tiny steps, tiny progress. What line did you lose today? What little thing, what little progress do we make? This podcast is produced by Hand to Hold, a national nonprofit, but we're more than simply a podcast. Be sure to download our app, join one of our support groups, or find one-to-one support, enjoy counseling, find loss and bereavement support, participate in a peer-to-peer mentor program, or check out our news, articles, and family stories at handtohold.org. All of that is at no cost to you. Hand to Hold's mission is to provide personalized support before, during, and after a NICU stay to help ensure that all NICU families thrive. So if there's a mom who suspects that she's got a high-risk pregnancy, what are some questions, Parijat, that she should ask her doctor to either mitigate the trauma or to say, like, what you were talking about, that control part, like, this is what I can't control. I know you mentioned about healthcare. What are some questions that she should be asking if this starts to become a theme in her pregnancy?
Absolutely. I think the first place to begin is asking what qualifies me as high risk, because that's such a vague term that can mean absolutely anything. Why am I considered high risk? What are the actual risk factors that are putting me at risk in this pregnancy? And what is it putting me at risk for? Is it risk to my health? Is it risk to baby's health? Is it to both? What I guide clients to think about is the goal of these conversations has to be, you need to have complete transparency about what your provider is thinking. You should walk out of that conversation having a complete map of what they're thinking in their kind of mental map. You should have access to that. And that includes things like what treatment options do I have available? What happens if I do nothing? Right? Because that is also an option. How much time do I have to make a decision? Very often, I think patients are rushed to make a choice for a variety of different reasons when we actually have more time than we're made to believe. And I say this even as somebody who had to make a really difficult decision in a triage moment in the hospital. They're making it seem like you've got 30 seconds. You can probably buy yourself a couple of minutes, which sounds so tiny, but is also can be just enough time for you to collect your thoughts, talk to whoever you need to talk to, and figure out what you need to do. If you're outside of a triage situation, you usually have days. So find out what that is. And if they're trying to push you to make a decision quickly, why? What is the rush? What happens if I wait? Really, if you can imagine, I picture it like a flow chart. Really understand what are your options and what are the outcomes of those options. And that way you can trace the map that you want to follow to go, okay, I think I want to go on this path here. I'm going to say yes to this, but no to this, but yes to this, but later. What is that outcome there? And you get to make those choices. I think there's a lot of opportunity to defer those decisions because they're so huge. The outcomes, the consequences can be so heavy. And so this is, I think, a really great way to kind of stop and slow that process down and say, where do I get a choice? And where's my voice? And who's listening and who's trusting them?
I love that analogy. That is an excellent way. And as a matter of fact, before you said it, I was thinking that sort of sounds like a flow chart. So
Yeah.
I'm glad that we were on the same plane there. Okay, so I'm saving a few of my last questions they're the hardest questions, I think, because it's really where I want to ask you to give some advice to some women. So if there's a woman who is getting ready, she's experienced this pregnancy, perhaps preeclampsia was her high risk factor. The two-part question is, how does a woman who chooses not to pursue a pregnancy after that traumatic event, how does she heal from that trauma? And then on the other side, if a woman has experienced a difficult pregnancy and chooses to move forward with another pregnancy, how does she not let fear and anxiety be such a debilitating factor?
Love it. So with, let's say, the first example, I'll answer that, if you don't mind, just with a client example, so you can see how it
Sure.
played out in real life. So I have worked with many clients who've experienced preeclampsia in a previous pregnancy and other complications who after that were like, nope, never again, not doing this. I start by completely validating, and you don't have to hear me to do this. It's best for you to do this for yourself. But if you ever needed somebody to do this for you, fully validating that that is your choice. There's no expectation. You're not trying to check somebody else's boxes. You are allowed to make that choice. And often when I say this to a client, I can just visibly see their whole body just sink into their chair because there's such a sense of, I shouldn't be. Should I be? Should I consider, am I doing the wrong thing? There's a conflict there of expectations, whether it's self-imposed, societal expectations, whatever it may be. And then what your impulse is telling you to do, which is, no, I don't want to do this again. Beyond that, then once we kind of, I'm thinking about one client in particular, when she allowed herself to really go, yes, I'm owning this decision. This is mine. And I have chosen this, regardless of what other people say. Then after that, a lot of what we do is the somatic piece of helping her body complete that stress cycle that couldn't be completed at the time of her delivery or during the NICU. We really go very gently with her body to help really come down from what she's been holding on to. Her body has been living as if that moment is happening for weeks, months, or years, and it's happening every day. And so we kind of have to meet them where that is and go, okay, this is how your body thinks it is, 2018, July 5th still. And so that's where we are. And we have to go, what did your body need at that time that you couldn't do? Maybe because you were medicated, maybe you were under anesthesia, maybe you had to get up from bed really fast because you needed to get to the NICU, maybe because you couldn't walk. I mean, there's so many reasons, none of which were your fault. But we have to go back there and go, what couldn't happen back then? You do that and you complete that stress cycle, and it feels and looks and sounds like magic. but it's really just following physiology. When we give our bodies what it needs, it's kind of simple because your body's looking for it anyway. It's not easy, but it is relatively simple, which I think is so powerful.
If I can, before you answer the second part of that, because I think you said something that I think is really important. I think people listening to this, maybe they've been through a NICU experience and they know how traumatic and difficult it can be. And so when someone says to them, I don't know if I can do this again, this isn't, and I don't mean to minimize the difficult choices that every family have to make when they decide to or not to have another baby. But it is really difficult because you find yourself back in that space again, and you have to address that because it took us 5 years to be at peace with, yes, let's have another baby. But even if we had chosen not to have another baby, that still would have been the right choice for our family. So I think it's really important that we validate the actual fear, which can be incredibly debilitating, of what it means do I have to go through that again? I think it's important, and I'm really glad that you said that. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I thought it was so good. I had to remind people of that.
Absolutely. No. And if you don't mind me just adding on to that, is that the fear comes from lived experience.
Yes.
I think so many people are made to believe, oh, well, it wasn't that bad, or it's not going to be that bad next time. And hopefully not. But my lived experience tells me it was that bad last time. And that is going to inform how I feel about doing it again. When I do workshops and trainings, I use an analogy of being chased by a bear. It's also in pregnancy brain. But another analogy that we could use here is, in the last pregnancy, when you developed preeclampsia, it was like you walked into a lion's den. And there was a lion in there.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Our bodies as mammals are designed to remember that at a sensory level, at a cellular level. And unlike almost anything else in the world that we will go through, trying to get pregnant again, or thinking about being pregnant again, or being pregnant again, is literally walking back into that lion's den and hoping that lion's not there. Of course you're going to be scared. Of course that's going to happen. And so when I work with clients who do want to get pregnant again, that's the first thing I tell them. I am not going to ask you to not be scared. You're going to be scared because that's a biological response.
Thank you for saying that. Yes.
Yeah.
It's normal.
It's normal. It is to be expected. I would be concerned if you weren't scared.
Right.
Because your entire body remembers that. And it's supposed to remember that.
So as that mom sort of moves into that new pregnancy and she's walking back into the lion's den, what are some things that you do, Parijat, to help her to find some peace with that, but also perhaps even hopefully that she might even find some healing in that subsequent pregnancy?
Yep, absolutely. We do kind of 3 things: help them find peace, because I think nearly every one of my clients who wants to get pregnant again understands, like, anything can happen again. And I get that. I just want to be at peace with whatever happens next time. But I also want to do whatever I can to reduce my risk of that happening. Sure. So how do we do that? And then the third piece is, how do I be at peace with what happened before? And those 3 things are beautifully addressed in a somatic approach, because we get to go deep into the body to go, what is the story your body is telling? What happened then that couldn't be addressed that we can address now, which is why I start my work with clients before they're even ready to try to conceive. Because the one thing that is in common with people, all of us who've experienced traumatic stress, is if we haven't completed that cycle, we don't have access to our full body. And you might be sitting here right now and you can think about it and you can go, I can feel most of my body, but I haven't really felt my pelvic region in a long time. Or, I never realized I can't really feel my neck, or something like that. You have a neck, but you can't quite feel it. That is a cornerstone experience of unresolved trauma, for example. And so we have to start by getting her back into her body first. And then we can hear the story. And then we start to complete that cycle that couldn't be completed from the previous pregnancy. And then the core of the work that we do during the pregnancy, again, is not to stop her from feeling anxious or worried or scared. That is never the goal. It is always to to get her body to be able to complete that cycle every time she gets scared, and then we complete and bring it back down. And then we have a moment, I'm anxious about this appointment, and then we come back down. You'll read it in pregnancy brain, but stress is never the problem. Our bodies can totally handle that. We are extremely resilient. What we want to do is when that stress response, that threat response gets elevated, to bring back down and stay down as long as possible. Bring back down as quickly as possible, stay down as long as possible. And then you have that, 18-week appointment, which was the scary one last time. Wow. That's okay. Of course you're going to be scared. We prepare for that. We plan for that. We give her what the resources she needs now that she didn't have last time, so that she can get through that appointment completely embodied, full access to her sensory system, full access to her ability to move around in the appointment. Really taking the somatic approach to support her body to come back down quickly. You do that, the experience is not going to be encoded as traumatic.
Ask you a billion questions, but I'm looking at my time and I'm like, you've got things to do. So I always ask this of every guest, because I think your advice is invaluable, and certainly from both lived and also experience that you have with your particular clients. What advice would you give to a woman who finds herself in a high-risk pregnancy and she doesn't know what to do with that diagnosis?
I would say two things. One, give yourself a chance to sit with that. It's heavy, it's big, it's scary, it's vague. Give yourself a minute to really sit with that. I know mine does at least. It goes a mile a minute to go, what's the plan? Okay, what do I do? Where's the checklist? And that's great. Fully pro checklist here, but give yourself a minute to really hold that and hear that and sit with that for a second. And then beyond that, I would say ask a lot of questions. You never want to take something that a provider tells you as complete and total truth, because the fact of the matter is nobody knows. There is no 100% certainty. If you're listening to this podcast, you know that very well. You have lived experience of that. And so we need to be reminded of that you might hear something that's really hard to hear. I know I've been there. Those awful statistics, those scary diagnoses, that look on the doctor's face when they're trying to keep it together to tell you something devastating.
Yeah.
And you have every right to ask as many questions as you need to get as much information as you need to make the next decision. And sometimes that can mean you get a second opinion, you get a third opinion, you get a fourth opinion. Sometimes it means replacing people on your team. But please always remember that you are the leader of that team and you get to decide how this goes. Again, you may not be able to influence the exact outcome, but you are at the head of that table and you get to influence the journey to that outcome, whatever that may be.
Such good advice. It's a reminder that, and good validation, that as the carriers of these, babies, that they rely on us to be their advocates until they can advocate for themselves. So thank you for reminding people it's okay to ask questions, and a lot of them. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This is such a joy and pleasure. Thank you.
Well, we have come full circle, haven't we? We got good education, we got lived experience, and then today we learned what does it look like to navigate through grief and trauma, and what does your body do through all of those seasons. I am in awe, really, of the candidness and the honesty in which all of our guests shared with us. In today's 2-minute take, I think it feels kind of impossible to wrap it all up in 2 minutes, but there are many things that Parijat said that I found myself, if you watch the YouTube video, you can see me vigorously shaking my head yes on many of the things that she shared. But perhaps it was the one that she was talking about, the flow chart, that when you're given a diagnosis and you're given statistics, which sometimes we feel like if you're in the NICU community, you feel like your whole life is a series of statistics. The 20% this, the 5% that, the 80% that, the 50% this, and it can feel overwhelming. And I really appreciated her really direct and practical advice of saying, okay, so let's work with the 50% or let's work with the 10%. What does that mean? And then her advice at the end of ask as many questions as you can, because understanding and curiosity helps you make the best possible decision in that moment for you and your baby and for your family. So many of the things that she shared, I felt were validating. I was also shaking my head on many of those things, that it's so validating to hear what she had to say, and that your trauma and your grief are real, and they are not this made up thing, but they really did happen to you. Your lived experience really did happen. And then what do you do post that? And I think that her book certainly would be a great resource for you, but perhaps I think it is that flow chart of thinking about, okay, if I say yes to this and no to this and yes to this and yes to this, where does that leave us at the end? And so allowing yourself the time to ask the questions, to take a breath, and to say, what's next? Thank y'all so much for being here for this really impactful. I am so proud of these guests and this series, and I hope that it continues to be a source of encouragement and blessing and hope for you as you navigate through your own high-risk pregnancy. And with that, I'll see you next time. Thanks, y'all, for listening to NICU Babies Parent Support. Every parent and every experience is welcome here. If you are a NICU parent and you're finding yourself in need of support, please download our app. You can find it in the Apple Store or on Google Play, Hand to Hold. And if you love today's episode, you can share it, you can subscribe, and you can most certainly review it. We would love, love, love your reviews. It's how we reach more NICU parents. Thanks, and I'll see y'all next time.